Like most Dragon Ball enjoyers of a certain age range, the Budokai Tenkaichi or Sparkin series was a major part of my late childhood, which meant the recent announcement of a new entry in the series that was more than a spin-off was something wanted for almost 16 years now, with what has the codename Sparkin Zero, but we'll call it Tenkaichi 4 for simplicity until it gets an official title. Of course, with such a long wait, there's a lot of expectations for it to live up to the legacy it's followed, and today I'm going to list my main 10. I'd hoped to have done this after more news than the reveal of a few seconds of beta footage came out, but it seems that's taken too long. Before that, an honourable mention for the Tenkaichi series as a whole, with the announcement making it apparent the series isn't trapped in a purgatorial state due to the merger of Spike into Spike Chunsoft. There's now no reason for the original trilogy not to have a re-release, like the Budokai HD collection. Beyond some improved graphics and programming the controls for an Xbox port, the only major change necessary would be for the first game's soundtrack to be changed, and that could be fixed simply by having the Sparkin soundtrack be an international one. But more on that later. One thing about BT3 that disappointed some people was that most of the characters were already unlocked at the start, which made the feeling of accomplishment in unlocking them throughout the story and more not as grand as its predecessor. This can go either way in an age where many will be wanting to unlock characters to use online ASAP, rather than spending too long to get them, but I side with those wanting accomplishment, and I hope the modern take of this 2000s trilogy will heed more from Xenoverse than Fighter Z in that department. Tournament modes were a major part of Dragon Ball games starting with the PS2 era, and this peaked with Tenkaichi 3's various different tournaments, with those to come after being either limited to just the Tenkaichi Budokai and Cell game, or removed entirely. With this game including super content, it's certainly a golden opportunity to add to these tournament modes, with a tournament of power if implemented properly. The Tenkaichi games have had quite varying story modes. Tenkaichi was a series of battles with little storytelling context. Tenkaichi 2 had a major focus on a near all-encompassing story, to the extent it can seem overly long. And Tenkaichi 3 would have managed to condense its storytelling well, if not for how many major battles were cut. With many recent Dragon Ball games putting far less focus on authentically adapting the main story, and Kakarot having set the bar for how well to do a thorough adaptation, how Tenkaichi 4 will handle the story is something I'm curious on. At the very least, I'd hope for there to be some adaptation of the main story, but with what I'll mention on its own in the next point. One of the most iconic parts of Dragon Ball video game story modes in general are their what-if scenarios to see how a slight change could open up a wholly different story. And if wanting to see some I've constructed myself, check out those in this playlist. The Tenkaichi series had a few creative ones, such as the Raditz-centric Fateful Brothers in Tenkaichi 2, or Tenkaichi 3's scenario of Akuman defeating Frieza and Cold with the Akumite beam, even with a few stinkers like BT2's Beautiful Treachery, or ones that are at best switch your brain off popcorn entertainment, such as BT3's Galactic Battle. There's enough creativity in the Tenkaichi series alone for what-ifs to be an anticipated highlight when playing its story, whether they be a linear divergence or an option through how the regular battles go as BT3 had, if they weren't limited to purely the scope of one level. One of the iconic parts of the Tenkaichi series that was slightly inspired by modes within Budokai 2 and 3, as well as in turn inspired one within Rage and Blast, is the Ultimate Battle mode, where you have a series of battle scenarios with certain rules or unique teams. Tenkaichi had a ranking system in which you try and become number 1 out of 100 fighters. Tenkaichi 2 had you run the gauntlet of a specific theme, like film villains or child characters, and Tenkaichi 3 had you fight against specific teams, but with limitations such as only being able to use 2 characters, or having a team composing 15 destruction points. as well as adding the more RPG-style Sim Dragon, and a revamped version of the first two games modes with Disc Fusion on the PS2. This definitely needs to make a return in some form, and certainly has a place in modern Dragon Ball games, with BT3's take sharing some similarities to Xenoverse's parallel quests that could open up new directions for this mode in the series' upcoming title. Something there's no debate was better in Rage and Blast than Tenkaichi was the ability to change a character's super attacks, and thereby not need multiple versions of the character as Tenkaichi 3 had with early, mid and end Goku. I honestly don't mind BT3's approach, with the different versions having differing combos, and show the evolution in the fighting styles of Goku, Piccolo or Vegeta, but taking the Rage and Blast approach would be best if wanting to be conservative with the character slots. The main addition needed for this though would be for ultimate attacks to also be customized, as some attacks certainly need to be given their glory and not reduced to supers, such as Goku's Shunkan Ido Kamehameha. Amongst the many strides Kakarot made to become what I'd consider the best Dragon Ball game, one that doesn't get talked of much is the return of orchestral versions of the anime's musical scores, to truly highlight the experience of reliving the events of the series, and making it apparent having the series' original score internationally in the video game is no longer something hidden behind paid DLC or copyright regulations. With this, I do hope that the new Sparkin uses renditions of the anime soundtrack as its predecessors did, and this isn't altered when the game is released overseas, or at the very least, give us the option to switch to it. The soundtracks of the Tenkaichi trilogy were fine, but when stacked up to the Japanese score, there's no competition. An aspect that most people overlook in the depth of Tenkaichi 3's gameplay is how the items can lead to builds that completely change the use of a character. For example, 16 would be considered fairly mediocre in his combos and finishing moves, but give him Master Throw and he becomes capable of shredding through half a health bar in a single throw. If you want a good display of the variations through builds, the channel Dragon Ball Z League presents this very well, with how prevalent online and competitive scenes are in modern gaming. Acknowledging this and polishing how effective item builds are on a character would definitely help Tenkaichi 4's competitive community become mainstream and consistent, rather than dying off once a new entry comes out like the Rage and Blast games or Burst Limit. Speaking of which, in recent years, online PvP has become the standard for Dragon Ball games to the point Fighter Z and the Breakers are primarily online. With this new title being done by the same people as Fighter Z though, this is worrying if wanting to capture the spirit of the original Sparkin series, as it may convince them to focus more on online modes than single player, which will drastically limit the game's shelf life. Unless the online play of a game is near perfect, the player base of games that rely on online PvP or constant events to keep its player base alive tend to die off after a year or so, in what I'll call the Call of Duty effect, which is why I severely hope Tenkaichi 4 treats online as an additional bonus rather than a major component. The most obvious thing everyone will be desiring is a character roster to live up to Tenkaichi 3's quantity and have the variation of that game. With every game in the original trilogy having built further on the roster, it would definitely seem like a downgrade if many of the characters from that game didn't return, in what's explicitly a game to bank on nostalgia. Having a good amount of characters from all major entries in the franchise is something that has allowed its roster to be more revered than those of arguably greater quantity, like Xenoverse 2, which is severely lacking in characters from the original Dragon Ball anime. It's probably the most important aspect in determining how fans will view it compared to what preceded it, and, most importantly, don't have this perfect roster hidden behind paid DLC. That's probably the worst thing about modern Dragon Ball games. With that, we have the main things to add or avoid with Tenkaichi 4 to make it a true successor to the legacy it carries, and a great Dragon Ball game in general. Thank you for listening until the end. If wanting to see more Dragon Ball content, check out this playlist, and subscribe for more I release in the future.